journey through Romans, carrying on from where we left last week. And today we are in Romans chapter 6, verses 15 to 23. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? By no means. Don't you know that when you offer yourselves to someone to obey him as slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey? Whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you wholeheartedly obeyed the form of teaching to which you were entrusted. You have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness. I put this in human terms because you are weak in your natural selves. Just as you used to offer the parts of your body in slavery to impurity and to ever-increasing wickedness, so now offer them in slavery to righteousness, leading to holiness. When you were slaves to sin, you were free from the control of righteousness. What benefit did you reap at that time from the things you are now ashamed of? Those things result in death. But now that you have been set free from sin and have become slaves to God, the benefit you reap leads to holiness, and the result is eternal life. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord.
Father, we thank you that we can have this chance together to open your word, to explore it, to see your word for us. And we pray that at this time where there is so much fear about what's happening with the coronavirus, Lord, we pray that you would help us to, as well as having that in our minds, Lord, in a healthy and helpful way, Lord, help us to focus on these even deeper, more wonderful and significant gospel truths that are significant for all eternity. Help us to understand what you were saying through Paul in this passage, both back in the time when Paul was writing, but also to help us understand how it applies to our lives today in the 21st century. Help us, Lord, we pray. Move among us and be glorified here, we ask, in the name of Jesus. Amen. We've got the rules out this pointing somewhere.
Yeah, dropped it somewhere near you.
Somewhere near it's here. Okay, well, last week, as with this Sunday, the passage starts with a question. And in last week's sermon, and for the notes that went up on the screen, I put the question up on the screen. That's not the right set of slides.
The only Romans 6 on the fob.
Okay, we don't have slides today. But I can still show you the question I put up there, and then we put up this question, which was, shall we go on sinning so that sin may increase? Now, thank you to everyone who spoke to me afterwards to point out that it was wrong. I'm sure others noticed it as well, who didn't come and speak to me. Well done if you realised it was wrong. Can I ask you, how did you know it was wrong? How did you know that this wasn't the right thing? I'm guessing mostly it's because you knew that wasn't what verse 1 says. And what it should say What it should have said was, shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? That's the question that's lifted straight from verse 1 of chapter 6. Now, thankfully, that was the basis of the sermon, not the kind of incorrect thing. That was just a mistype. So what we looked at was all fine, but this does serve as a helpful reminder of how important it is that you have your Bible open when the Word of God is preached. Because clearly the preacher can make mistakes. And whilst no harm was done last week, it's so important that when God's Word is preached, which God willing will be life-changing, it's so important that we can see that this truly reflects what the Bible says. So, please do take your Bibles. And if you're watching this on the live stream, this applies to you too. The only difference is really between whether people are watching at home or watching here, or in here, is I can direct people at home to the windowsills where there are still spare Bibles. Have your Bibles open, please, at Romans 6, and our passage starts from verse 15, where Paul asks another question. And Vince, if you want to get rid of that one now, because we have a different question from verse 15, which is, what then shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? So here's the new question for this week's passage. Shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? And the premise of the question is essentially, if we've been freed from the law, if the penalty of the law no longer applies to us, is there any need to keep obeying it? And whilst that may sound like a ridiculous question to some of us, it is actually a good question, isn't it? Because there's a kind of logical flow to the question. Indeed, it may be a question that you've asked yourself. And as you speak to other people about Jesus, it's likely that at some point this kind of question will be asked of you. Especially when we introduce the idea of grace. When we explain that we're not saved by anything we do, but rather what God has done. When we make it clear that we're sinners totally undeserving of forgiveness, and that however good we try and be, we cannot be good enough to earn salvation. When we get that in our minds, that we cannot do anything to earn salvation at all. As that reality dawns on people, it isn't unusual to ask, well, what is the point of obedience then? If we're saved even though we're sinners, what's the point in changing our ways? Why not carry on sinning? After all, that's much more fun, isn't it? You can do much more stuff when you sin. You can do fun stuff, exciting things. Following the law is boring. It's no fun. So why don't we become Christians and get forgiveness? That's the good bit. That's the bit that everyone wants. And then we can carry on doing what we want, knowing that we're forgiven. Now, if you haven't ever come across people thinking in those lines, then you probably haven't ever talked to anyone else about your faith. People think in those lines, and it comes through in all kinds of ways. It even comes through on many films. It comes through in TV programs, in books, and people think through the process and come to that conclusion. I wonder, if you were asked that question, how would you respond? If you were asked, well, why shouldn't I just carry on sinning now I'm not going to be forgiven? Would you be prepared? Would you be ready to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have? If they ask this kind of thing. Why carry on obeying? Well, as we look at this passage, one of my prayers is that we will become better prepared to respond to that kind of question. The kind of question about why we shouldn't carry on sinning since we're under grace. Because we're going to take a look at how Paul responds to the question. Now, in reality, there are so many ways that we could respond to that line of thinking because there's just so much wrong with it. And as we continue to go through this book of Romans, seeing how Paul responds and learning from that, learning from God's word itself, seems like a very good idea and a very good way of preparing ourselves to explain why we have a hope of Christ and not in the paths of sin. And as we start this passage, we see that Paul starts off with an immediate and firm answer. So verse 15, what then shall we sin because we are not under law but under grace? How does he respond? By no means. Absolutely not. By no means. And in the verses that follow, Paul sets out why this is such a foolish notion. How indeed the reality of being under grace is totally incompatible with continuing to sin. And it comes down to this: your actions reflect who your master is. And if the slides were up on the screen, so if you want to kind of recreate it in your mind or on a note paper or something, at the top was the question, who is your master? Who is your master? That's the big question that comes in certain ways from this passage. Because your actions reflect who your master is. Or putting it even more strongly, what you do, how you live your life, whether you follow the law of God or just your own sinful desires, reflects who you are enslaved to. And within this passage, we are presented with two options. Either you are a slave to sin, or you are a slave to God. That's the two options. There's no third option about not being a slave. Two options: slave to sin or slave to God. And what we're going to do is go through the way those two things unfold. And again, on your kind of imaginary points or whatever like that, what there would have been up on the screen would be two columns. At the top of one column is slave to sin. At the top of the other one, slave to God. So in one column, slave to sin, on the other, slave to God. And what we want to do is look at what Paul says about these two realities, starting with the two categories themselves, slave to sin and slave to God. Now, at this point, you may be thinking, hang on a minute, I thought becoming a Christian gives us freedom. Didn't Jesus say, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed? And you're right, he did say that, didn't he? It's true that in Christ we're free. We have real freedom, unlike anything we had before we were saved, including the kind of things that we were talking about last week, like a freedom from the penalty of sin and a freedom from the power of sin. We have a real freedom. But what Paul is doing here isn't contradicting that. Rather, he's using similar language to make a related but different point. And that is, by the way, a helpful reminder that the illustrations, including biblical ones, are just illustrations, and we shouldn't push them further than they're meant to go. And Paul himself admits that using this language isn't a perfect description. Verse 19, I put this in human terms because you are weak in your natural selves. In other words, using it in an illustration, says Paul, will help us understand. And it is a powerful illustration, the imagery of slavery. Even when Paul wrote this was a powerful illustration. You may well have heard people explain that in Paul's day, slaves were often treated quite well. It was more like we'd imagine servants to be. Rather than that image that we might have of badly treated slaves working on a plantation or something like that. Now, that may be true. Or sometimes it may be true that slaves were treated better than we might imagine. But actually, any slave was still lacking freedom. They were still bound to their master, and our identity was still bound to their master. They were still often treated badly and had no meaningful rights. It was still generally a miserable experience that no one would ever choose. So for Paul to describe us Christians as slaves to God was very powerful and in many ways an uncomfortable illustration. But as he continues in verse 19, he spells out what the comparison points to. Verse 19, I put this in human terms because you are weak in your natural selves, just as you used to offer the parts of your body in slavery to impurity and to ever-increasing wickedness, so now offer them in slavery to righteousness, leading to holiness. So here's the next point of comparison on our list. So if you're making that list, or if you're imagining that list, on one side we have offering ourselves to impurity. That's in the slaves to sin side. And on the other side, offering ourselves to righteousness. You see, as slaves to sin, we are offering ourselves, or the parts of our body, as the verse is expressed, to impurity. As slaves to God, we're offering ourselves and the parts of our bodies to righteousness. And the basic message of this is that the way we behave, the things that we do, reflect who we serve. Look back at verse 16. Don't you know, says Paul, that when you offer yourselves to someone to obey him as slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey. In other words, who we are enslaved to is reflected in our actions. If we're obeying sin, we're enslaved to sin. If we're obeying God, we're enslaved to God. The actions reflect who or what we're offering ourselves to. Our actions must or will reflect the master we're obeying. Paul continues, verse 16 still, whether you are slaves to sin, which leads to death, or to obedience, which leads to righteousness. So our actions will reveal whether we're slaves to sin, or in this verse, slaves to obedience. And that notion of being slaves to obedience obviously refers to following God in obedience. In verse 19, the parallel expression to that is being slaves to righteousness. By the time we get to verse 22, the parallel expression is being slaves to God. So we're either slaves to sin, or we're slaves to obedience and righteousness and God. And our actions reflect who we're slaves to. Don't you know, says Paul, that when you offer yourselves to someone to obey them as slaves, you are slaves to the one whom you obey. So if we're sinning, we're obeying sin, and thus we're slaves to sin. If we're acting in righteousness, we're obeying God, and thus slaves to God. So let me ask you, what do your actions say about who your master is? What are the parts of your body being offered to? Impurity or righteousness? What does your life speak about who your master is? Now, you can imagine someone objecting to Paul at this point and saying, but Paul, it isn't as simple as that. You know, I'm a Christian and I do really want to act in obedience to God, but sometimes I still follow my sinful desires. And it's a good observation, isn't it? It's an honest observation, and Paul himself elsewhere acknowledges it's true of himself. Because it isn't as simple as the Christian always behaving righteously because God is their master. And each one of us who's a Christian can testify that it isn't simple. There's a confusing complexity in our response to sin. Because sometimes it is as if sin was still our master. So what is Paul saying here? Is he saying that if we sometimes love to sin, then sin is our master and not God? Well, we'll note how Paul continues in verse 17. But thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you wholeheartedly obeyed the form of teaching to which you were entrusted. You have been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness. So now we're going to introduce another line of comparison between now what we were and what we are. So, they're appearing on the screen, it looks like. So we're down to the point, what we were as slaves to sin and what we are as slaves to God. Because that's what Paul is saying here. He says you used to be slaves to sin. Paul is talking to Christians here. He's talking to people who have been saved by the blood of Jesus and as such have been set free from sin. And Paul is speaking to Christians, slaves to God rather than slaves to sin, who have, verse 17, wholeheartedly obeyed the form of teaching to which they were entrusted, which is Paul's way of saying that they have followed the teaching of the apostles and come to Christ. But if you look at verse 19, see how Paul speaks to these Christians. Verse 19, I put this in human terms because you are weak in your natural selves. Now, we've already said that Paul has explained he needs to use an illustration so that they can understand. But what is it that they're having trouble understanding? What is it that Paul needs to explain through an illustration so that they can grasp more fully? In what were they weak in their natural selves? Paul continues, just as you used to offer the parts of your body in slavery to impurity and to ever-increasing wickedness, so now offer them in slavery to righteousness leading to holiness. Paul is instructing these Christians to offer the parts of their bodies to righteousness, rather than the pattern they used to follow, offering the parts of their bodies to impurity. Now, why does Paul need to say this? Why does Paul need to say you need to offer the parts of your body to righteousness? He needs to say it because it's hard. Because it doesn't come easily, it doesn't come naturally. And that means that because of the weakness in our natural selves, we could easily dismiss it as being unimportant. We could easily think to ourselves, well, I'm going to be forgiven anyway, so I may as well carry on sinning. Which is why Paul has chosen to explain it in such strong language, in the language of slavery, to impress upon them how very important this is. This is of such great importance. You see, Paul's point isn't that our actions decide whether we're saved or not. His point is that our actions must reflect whether we're saved or not. Because our actions in themselves aren't what saves us, are they? We know that. That's the whole notion of grace. That's something that's already been explored by Paul. It's not through our works that we are saved. And it's not through our works that we maintain our salvation. It's all through Jesus. We're saved by grace alone, and our salvation is maintained by grace alone. But Paul is keen to make us see that we need to take this absolutely seriously. Because if you continue to sin, you are acting like you are still enslaved to sin. Indeed, it may be that you are still enslaved to sin. It may be that you haven't actually been set free from your slavery to sin. It may be that you are not actually saved. You see, elsewhere, Paul makes it clear that there are people who will, in many ways, seem to be Christians, but will fall away because they never really trusted in Jesus. In fact, that's probably what the parable of the different grounds that the seed is sown in is showing. The 4 different grounds, and only the good soil are the ones who are truly saved. You see, a continuation in sin may well be an indication that an individual is not truly saved. Because someone who has, as verse 17 expresses it, wholeheartedly obeyed Christ, surely cannot wholeheartedly obey sin as well. One of the things that Christian has done as they put their trust in Jesus is to repent from their sin. They've turned away from their sin with a recognition of how awful it is. Now, of course, even when we've repented, there is an attraction of sin. We know that ourselves. We know what temptation means. And sometimes, through struggle, we still do follow the way of sin. But to consistently follow the way of sin, to wholeheartedly embrace sinful choices, maybe that is someone who is still enslaved to sin. But Paul's main point is, verse 17, thanks be to God that though you used to be slaves to sin, you wholeheartedly obeyed the form of teaching to which you were entrusted. You've been set free from sin and have become slaves to righteousness, and therefore obey. Offer the parts of your body to righteousness leading to holiness. See, once we as Christians were enslaved to sin, but have been set free from that sin. Sin, something that's ugly. And instead of being enslaved to righteousness, something that's beautiful. And this, of course, is through the work of Jesus on the cross, where he died to take the punishment for our sins, if we repent and turn to him as our King. And Paul is saying, if we've truly done that, if we've been truly taken out of that slavery to sin, if we have been bought with that very costly price, the cost of Jesus and his suffering on the cross, if that reflects our story, if we are now, by the grace of God, slaves to righteousness, let's make sure our actions reflect that truth. Because how you act reflects your master. And not only that, it also reflects the direction of your life. And the next contrast we see here is between ever-increasing wickedness and holiness. So a new line under the two columns are on the side of slaves to sin, ever-increasing wickedness, on the side of slaves to God, holiness. See, those who are slaves to sin find themselves in a spiral of ever-increasing wickedness. Those who are slaves to God find themselves with ever-growing holiness. In the ESV, the word holiness is translated as sanctification. Although the focus here isn't so much on how sanctification happens, that is, how God works in our lives to make us more like Christ, to make us more pleasing to him, more obedient to him. That isn't the key focus of these verses, although I'm sure that was in Paul's mind as he wrote this. But I think his main concern is that the Christian should long for sanctification. To long to be holy as God is holy. By showing us the connection between what we do, how we act, how we offer ourselves up. The connection between that and the master we serve. Paul is trying to help us see we should be longing for holiness. Because if we are followers of Christ, we want to be like him. We want to reflect him in our lives. But look again at verse 19. Just as you used to offer the parts of your body in slavery to impurity and to ever-increasing wickedness, so now offer them in slavery to righteousness, leading to holiness. So holiness will be reflected in our lives if we're offering the parts of our bodies in our slavery to righteousness. But if we offer ourselves to sin, we will gain an ever-increasing wickedness. And I think that is true even for Christians who go in a sinful direction. See, very often we can have the thought that we could probably get away with just dabbling in sin. We feel the guilty conscience maybe, but block it off. Of course, every time we block it off, we grow colder and colder in our hearts, and we learn to deaden our consciences more and more. And in the meantime, our wickedness spirals downwards, often in ways that can be socially acceptable. For example, as long as you're not too in the face about it, it's completely socially acceptable to be covetous, always wanting more. Of course, the reality, though, is the more you get, the more you want. Because however much we get, whether we get the best job, the biggest house, the newest phone, whatever it is, it never satisfies. And so the wickedness increases as we set our hearts on more and more things. And it's the same with more hidden patterns of wickedness. For example, it's very well documented that with pornography, there's a spiral of ever-increasing wickedness. That's using the language of this text. Where once mild images were exciting, more and more graphic content is needed. There's a spiraling effect, which is one reason why it's so good to get accountability and help from other people. Organisations like Covenant Eyes are brilliant help with things like that, just to help it, because as it spirals, it becomes more and more difficult. Because whether we're talking about socially acceptable sin or hidden sin, we need to take it seriously and recognise that sinful actions belong to slaves of sin. And if we're truly Christians, we must not let them have any part in our lives. And maybe that will be meaning that we need to confide in someone, to get someone else's help, because God has the power to help us entirely, and in his sovereignty he's supplied each other to be a part of his answer. by his grace, Christ has made us righteous in his sight. And our actions must reflect the righteousness he's given us. Rather than ever-increasing wickedness, our lives must reflect an ever-increasing holiness as we become more and more like the creation, the new creation he has made us. Because as we continue in these contrasting ways, our experience also is contrasting. And here we've got another line of comparison, which is shame and holiness. Shame and holiness. Being a slave to sin brings us shame. But being a slave to God brings holiness. And yes, on one side there is a repeat of the previous line. But Paul does seem to compare these two things as types of fruit that we will receive. Now look at verse 21. What benefit did you reap at the time from the things that you are now ashamed of? What benefit did you reap at the time from the things you are now ashamed of? This is a really penetrating question, I think. And it links back to one of the things that we said right back at the beginning about becoming a Christian but carrying on sinning because it's so much more fun to carry on sinning. But is it really? Can we really say that a life of sin is more delightful than a life of following God's word? Well, Paul says that the Christian looks back at what they did with shame. Because as Christians, we get to see life as it really is. We get to see the horror of sin. And we get to see the beauty of Jesus. We get to see these things in ways that people who are not saved cannot see. And having that clarity is really helpful in truly seeing the lack of benefit in sinful ways. You see, it is really better following God's way. So many people think they go in a sinful direction is going to be more fun. If you're a husband or a wife, would a bit of sexual immorality really lead you to a better life for you and your spouse? Or would it ultimately increase your misery? If you've earned some money over the year, would cheating on your tax return really give more satisfaction in your wealth? Or would you be just as discontent as ever? Would drunkenness or drug use give you a more joyous life? Would cultivating your greed make you happier? Would engaging in gossiping help your relationships? Of course not. None of these things would. These things add to our misery because they add to our shame. And in our shame, as we consider our own sin, how sobering it is to think that the Lord Jesus died on the cross for things that we once thought were fun. When in most cases they led to misery. Our fun, which led Jesus to his death on the cross. But verse 22 says, but now that you have been set free from sin and have become slaves to God, the benefit you reap leads to holiness, and the result is eternal life. The benefit or the fruit that we receive from being slaves to God leads to holiness or sanctification. And the fact that these two fruits are compared reflects, I think, that the growth in holiness in our lives is so much sweeter, so much more wonderful, so much more amazing than anything we could experience as slaves to sin. And a big reason for that is that they both have the taste of their ultimate end, which is our penultimate kind of comparison between death and life. You see, being a slave to sin leads to death, being a slave to God leads to life. And the actions that follow those two paths have that strong taste of death, or that strong, sweet, beautiful taste of life. Verse 21 again. What benefit did you reap at the time from the things you are now ashamed of? These things result in death. No wonder we can look back with shame, because we can see them as they really are, as disgusting as they are. But now that you have been set free from sin and have become slaves to God, the benefit you reap leads to holiness, and the result is eternal life. Eternal life with God, eternal glory with Him. And we get just penalty for our sins, or the gift which is eternal life in Christ Jesus. And our last line of comparison is wages and gift. You see, this particularly relates to the line above. Where does the death come from? It comes from the wages. Where does the life come from? It comes from a gift. Verse 23, the most famous verse in this passage, I'm sure. For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. You see, the wages of sin, what we deserve for our sinfulness, is death. And none of us deserves eternal life because of what we have done. But it doesn't say that the wages of righteous behaviour is eternal life. It says the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. May I ask you, have you received that gift? Have you received that gift of eternal life in Christ Jesus? In Him, as you trust in Him and His work on the cross, as you make Him your King, have you received that gift of eternal life? When we've received that gift, when we see what we have turned from, how horrific our sin appears. And yes, we can quite quickly forget how revolting our sin is. Sometimes the longer we live as Christians, we take our eye off the game a little bit. Maybe spend less time reading God's Word, less time making sure we're with God's people, more time listening to the world, more time soaking those values in. Sometimes we take so easy for granted the gift of eternal life. And we can even find ourselves starting to think, well, what's the point of obedience? I'm saved by grace. But the way of sin is a way of slavery, and a way that ends in death. Whereas the way of righteousness is the way of God, and the way that ends in life. I wonder if someone did ask you, why do I need to obey if I'm saved by grace? If I'm already forgiven, what's wrong with just carrying on in sin? I wonder how you would respond. Can you say with Paul in verse 15, by no means, and explain the difference between a life enslaved to sin and a life enslaved to God and His righteous ways? I pray that you are more convinced by what Paul has said here this morning, that God's way is the best way. And I pray that you would be better equipped to speak of that with confidence, that the way of God is the most wonderful, most beautiful, most delightful, most joyous way that there is. See, that is the truth. May it be our experience too. Let's pray. Father, thank you that we have this chance to open your word, to explore it together. Lord, we ask that we will continue to reflect and draw in this lesson on the reality of sin and how it reflects an enslavement